The archive is open. Come in out of the cold, your chair is where you left it, the one by the lamp. Tonight I have set a smaller lamp beside it. The metal is dark, the handle plain, and the shallow reservoir holds only enough oil for a few hours. It is the sort of light that makes a room visible without making it bright. We will carry it through one quiet night on Hadrian's wall. You do not need to remember any of this. There is no test at the end. If you drift, I will keep reading. Let us begin at a gate. Daylight has thinned across the high ground. The stone underfoot still holds a little of the sun, but the wind has begun to take it away. On one side of the gateway, the wall continues toward a low rise. On the other, it disappears into distance, following ground chosen by surveyors, builders, and the practical demands of the frontier. This gate belongs to a milecastle, one of the small fortified crossings placed at intervals along the wall. The name is modern, but the pattern is ancient. A gateway passed through the barrier. A barrack building stood nearby. A small group, perhaps about 8 soldiers at many sites, could live beside the passage they were expected to control. The gate was not a door between two empty countries. Tracks approached it. People knew the crossing. Animals carried loads. Messengers, traders, soldiers, residents, and travelers moved through a landscape already inhabited before Roman stone divided its views. Hadrian's wall was a system rather than one object. It included the wall itself, a ditch in many places, the broad earthwork called the vallum to the south, roads, bridges, forts, milecastles, and turrets. English heritage counts 16 forts on the line, 80 milecastles, and 156 turrets. Those numbers describe the completed arrangement in broad terms, not one unchanging plan maintained identically for 3 centuries. Work began in the year 122 during the Emperor Hadrian's visit to Britain. Legionary soldiers did much of the building. The troops who later manned the frontier were mainly auxiliaries, recruited as non-citizen soldiers in units drawn from different provinces of the empire. The distinction matters. The men who cut and set one stretch of stone were not necessarily the men who watched beside it years later. Nor did the wall stay the same. Plans changed while it was being built. Forts were added to the line. Stone replaced turf in the west. Gates were altered. Units moved. The frontier shifted north to the Antonine Wall for a time, then returned. Buildings were rebuilt, abandoned, repaired, and used again. Our night is therefore not one date recovered intact. It is an arrangement made from surviving rooms, roads, tablets, inscriptions, leather, grain measures, drains, altars, and worn thresholds. Evidence from housesteads will stand beside evidence from Chesters, Birdoswald, Corbridge, and Vindolanda. They do not all belong to the same hour. The archive can bring their ordinary tasks into sequence, but it must not claim that one named person performed them all. At the milecastle, a wooden gate turns on its fittings. We cannot hear the exact sound it made, and we do not know the words exchanged beside it. The surviving stone shows where passage narrowed. The building beside it shows that people stayed near the crossing. The road shows that movement continued. Inside the small room, the lamp is lit. Its flame bends when air reaches beneath the door. A cloak hangs where damp wool might dry slowly. A vessel stands near the wall. Bedding is kept away from the draught as well as the room allows. Between this milecastle and the next stood two turrets, creating observation points at roughly 1/3 mile intervals. In fading light, that repeated pattern gives the frontier a rhythm: gate, tower, tower, gate. It does not make the landscape perfectly visible. A turret offers height and shelter, but mist, rain, darkness, and the folds of the ground still decide what can be seen. There is no alarm tonight. None is needed to make the watch real. A gate must still be secured or opened according to orders. A traveler may still be delayed. A message may still arrive. Oil must still be saved. Someone must still remain awake while others sleep. Here is the first detail to carry with you. The lamp beside the milecastle gate is smaller than the architecture around it, but it is the part a person can lift. Stone marks the frontier in miles. A hand carries the night in a few spoonfuls of oil. Carry the lamp east for a little while, not along the top of the wall, whose ancient walkway remains debated in detail, but beside the roads and paths that made the frontier work. The land changes along its 73 modern miles. In the east, the line approaches the Tyne and the settled corridors around what became Newcastle. Across the central section, stone climbs the hard edge of the wind sill, rising and falling over crags. Farther west, the ground opens toward river valleys, marshier land, and the Solway. No single night feels the same across all of it. Rain reaches one fort before another. A western road holds water where an exposed ridge loses it to the wind. A cart can move easily on one stretch and labor over ruts on the next. The wall is often imagined from a distance as a line seen all at once. People living beside it encountered smaller pieces. A gateway framed the road ahead. A turret blocked part of the sky. A ditch turned a direct walk into a longer one. A bridge decided where wheels could cross water. The frontier controlled movement, but control is not the same as stillness. Soldiers traveled between posts. Orders and reports moved with messengers. Supplies came from farms, workshops, ports, and towns. Merchants followed military demand. Families and craftspeople lived near forts. Animals carried riders, fodder, grain, tools, timber, leather, pottery, and fuel. South of much of the wall ran a military road, now called the Military Way. Farther south, the older Staingate Road had already linked forts before Hadrian's project began. Vindolanda stood on that earlier corridor, just south of the later wall. Its sequence of timber and stone forts reminds us that the frontier existed before the famous barrier and continued to change around it. At night, a road narrows to what the lamp can reveal. The flame catches one pale stone, then a wheel rut, then the wet edge of grass. Hooves are heard before an animal enters the light. A cart announces itself through wood, iron fittings, harness, and the uneven agreement between wheel and road. We should not invent the cart's owner or cargo. The archaeology already offers many possibilities. Grain had to reach granaries. Fuel had to reach ovens, furnaces, and bathhouses. Timber was required even where stone dominates the surviving view. Leather traveled as hides, equipment, shoes, and repairs. Pottery carried liquids and food. Metal fittings held buildings, vehicles, weapons, furniture, and clothing together. Road use also required paperwork. A person detached to another post became an absence on a strength report. A delivery became a quantity in an account. A request for transport could become a message written on wood. The frontier was built from stone, but administered through repeated marks, names, totals, measures, and acknowledgements. Near a fort, the road widens into a more crowded place. Buildings grow outside the military enclosure. The settlement is often called a vicus, a civilian community associated with the garrison. Its shape changed over time, and the earliest phases remain less visible at some sites. Later settlements could spread beyond the fort with houses, shops, workshops, shrines, and places serving food and drink. The people there were not one category called camp followers. Some were partners or relatives of soldiers. Some were merchants, craftspeople, laborers, tenants, or property holders. Some were enslaved. Some had traveled far. Others came from communities in Britain whose lives did not begin with the wall. Movement across the frontier created exchange as well as surveillance. Local materials entered military systems. Imperial habits changed in northern conditions. Beer appears in the Vindolanda tablets, where a simplified Roman story might expect only wine. Deities from different regions received dedications near one another. Clothing answered, whether more directly than idealized sculpture did. The road continues beyond the lamp. At the next observation point, someone may recognize the rhythm of approaching steps without seeing a face. A known messenger does not stop being known because the archive has lost the name. An unfamiliar traveler does not become an enemy merely because the night is dark. Watchfulness often means waiting long enough to distinguish one ordinary sound from another. Here is the detail to carry with you. Between each pair of milecastles, 2 turrets repeated the pattern of observation. On a clear day, the next post belonged to the visible landscape. At night, it might be near enough to know and too dark to see. The road brings us to a larger gate. Above it, the fort wall rises higher than a person. The entrance channels movement through one of several gateways. Inside, streets divide the enclosure into ordered spaces, though mud, repairs, smoke, animals, stored equipment, and daily use make the lived fort less tidy than its plan on paper. At the center stands the headquarters building, where administrative and ceremonial work gathers. Nearby is the commander's house, built on a different scale from the barrack rooms. Granaries lift stored grain above the damp ground. Workshops contain tools and materials. A hospital provides rooms for treatment. Barracks divide people into smaller military households. Not every fort held every building in the same form at the same time. Housesteads, Chesters, Birdoswald, and other sites were rebuilt across generations. A wall visible today may belong to a later phase than the first garrison. An open courtyard may once have been roofed. A doorway may have narrowed after the unit changed. Housesteads could accommodate a large auxiliary garrison, perhaps up to 800 men in some periods. Chesters became associated with cavalry, including the 2nd Asturians, a unit whose name carried an origin in northern Spain, even when the men serving later were not all newly arrived from there. Unit identities lasted longer than individual journeys. As evening advances, the fort does not simply switch off. A gate detail remains responsible for entry. Animals require feeding and inspection. A kitchen fire may be reduced rather than extinguished. Someone cleans a vessel that will be needed again. Equipment is placed where darkness will not make it impossible to find. The lamp enters a barrack. A long building is divided into rooms for a century's smaller groups. The exact arrangements changed, but space remained limited. Bedding, clothing, shields, weapons, cooking things, personal objects, and the dirt carried in from outside all competed with military order. The popular image of a Roman soldier often arrives fully equipped and alone. The archaeological person needed more. Shoes wore through, cloaks absorbed rain, belts lost fittings, wooden objects split, metal rusted, bodies became ill, letters went unanswered, food arrived unevenly. Every disciplined formation depended on repair, supply, care, and people whose names rarely entered formal history. Light makes status visible. The commander's house had rooms modeled on elite Mediterranean domestic architecture, adjusted for a northern fort. Officers could dine, receive visitors, keep records, and maintain family and professional relationships in surroundings unlike a crowded barrack room. The same rain fell on both roofs, but it did not produce equal comfort. Outside the military walls, other households settled for the night. The legal position of soldiers' families changed over Roman history, and residence patterns varied. Archaeology and writing show women and children as part of frontier communities, even when official military documents make them less visible than men on the rolls. At Birdoswald, inscriptions preserve the names of 2 children among the many who must have lived around the fort over time. A name proves presence more securely than it supplies a childhood. We can say that children crossed these spaces. We cannot restore their games, arguments, or private fears from the letters alone. In the fort, a door bar is set into place. The lamp passes a workshop where a hammer has stopped. Leather scraps remain near a bench. The room smells of oil, damp material, soot, and whatever task occupied it during the day. The granary is quieter. Its raised floor allows air to move beneath the stored crop and helps separate grain from ground moisture. Thick walls and buttresses support the building. Ventilation matters because a garrison cannot eat stone, however imposing the frontier appears. Rats and mice did not respect imperial planning. Dogs may have helped keep them away at sites such as Birdoswald. Cats, traps, careful storage, sweeping, and the simple speed of consumption all belonged to the struggle between food and spoilage. The hospital also remains part of the night. A strength report from the northern frontier could separate the sick, wounded, and those suffering from eye trouble from the number fit for duty. Those categories are administrative, but they point toward rooms where someone needed water, rest, examination, or treatment rather than a place on the watch. No fort settled into perfect silence. Hooves shifted, a hinge moved, wind found the edge of roof tile, a person coughed in a room whose name has been lost. Here is the detail to carry with you. Beneath the granary floor, air moved through a space too low for a person to use. The grain rested above it, and the garrison's future meals depended on that narrow current remaining open. In a room near the fort's administrative center, the lamp is placed beside a thin leaf of wood. Ink marks cross its surface in a practiced hand. The sheet is not paper. Many Vindelander tablets were made from specially prepared birch or alder, shaved to about 1 millimeter in thickness and often close to the size of a modern postcard. Their survival depended on wet, oxygen-poor deposits that kept fragile wood from disappearing. The most famous tablets mostly belong to Vinderlander's early timber forts during the decades before and around the beginning of Hadrian's Wall. They illuminate the northern military frontier, but we should not quietly move every message forward in time or north onto the finished barrier. One document, Tablet 154, is a strength report for the first cohort of Tungrians from the years around 92 to 97. It begins with the unit and its total strength, then counts men absent on detached duties. Others are recorded as present but unfit for active service, divided among the sick, wounded, and those with eye trouble. The remaining number is fit for duty. The report is unusual, perhaps an interim document prepared for a commander rather than a permanent monthly record. Its value lies partly in that unfinished administrative character. Someone needed to know not merely how many names belonged to the unit, but where people actually were and what they could do. Many were away, some had gone to Corbridge, others were detached on different assignments. A unit on a roster could therefore be spread across roads, posts, escorts, supply work, and official business. The frontier was manned by movement as much as by people standing still. Our representative knight belongs to a later wall system, but the same administrative problem continues. A gate detail needs enough people. A patrol changes the number in the barracks. Illness removes someone from ordinary duty. A messenger leaves one post and becomes expected at another. We do not know the exact watch schedule for every fort and period. Later military traditions cannot simply be copied backward to fill the gap. Trumpets, passwords, inspections, and rotations existed in Roman military life, but precision without local evidence would turn a plausible system into a falsely recovered timetable. So the archive keeps to the narrower record. A list is checked, a name is present, another is away. A person with an inflamed eye is not sent into darkness where sight is the task. Someone else takes the place. The change may have been routine enough to leave no story beyond the altered total. Administration also reached supplies. Accounts listed quantities of grain, beer, wine, meat, hides, transport, and money. Requests moved between officers and contractors. Applications for leave entered the written system. A person might wait for permission whose wording survives after the reason has become obscure. Literacy was uneven. Officers and clerks dominate parts of the tablet archive because their duties produced writing and because their rooms created particular deposits. Some letters were written by professional scribes for senders who added a greeting in their own hand. Other people appear only as names, workers, recipients, enslaved attendants, or totals in an account. Writing gave the army reach, but it did not give every person an equal voice. The lamp makes the wet ink shine briefly. Sand or time might help it dry. The tablet can be folded, tied, addressed, stored, carried, discarded, or burned. At Vinderlander, hundreds of tablets were found charred in what may have been an attempt to destroy correspondence before a garrison moved. The failed destruction became preservation. Infrared photography later revealed carbon ink that ordinary light could barely distinguish. Words intended for a short administrative life entered a much longer one. On the wall, a person leaves the office carrying an instruction. The tablet stays behind. Outside, the count becomes physical, one figure at a gateway, another on a road, another resting because the body will not perform what the list requires. Here is the detail to carry with you. A military unit could look complete when written as one total. Beneath it, smaller numbers told the truth of the night: absent, present, unwell, and fit for duty. The lamp returns to the granary, then travels toward the rooms where food is measured, prepared, and distributed. An army eats by repetition. Grain arrives in bulk and leaves in portions. It must be kept dry, guarded from pests, milled, mixed, baked, and carried. A delay on the road becomes a smaller store inside the fort. Damp in a building becomes waste. A broken mill or exhausted animal becomes a problem that no speech from an emperor can solve. At Chester's, English heritage cares for a bronze vessel called a modius, a standard grain measure found at Carvoran. It may have been used to measure weekly corn rations for soldiers. The object does not preserve every ration practice along the wall, but its shape makes administration tangible. A quantity became repeatable because grain could be leveled at the same rim. Measurement did not make supply simple. Grain came from land worked by people whose legal status and relationship to the army varied. Contractors negotiated deliveries. Carts required wheels, axles, animals, drivers, and passable roads. Sacks tore, storekeepers counted, millers breathed dust, bakers managed fuel and heat. Near the frontier, food combined imperial expectations with local conditions. Wheat and other grains traveled through military systems. Meat came from animals raised, traded, slaughtered, and preserved. Fish, dairy products, vegetables, fruit, sauces, and imported goods appear unevenly in archaeology and writing. One officer's table cannot stand for a barrack, and one rubbish deposit cannot become the menu of the wall. The Vindelander tablets mention beer often enough to correct the image of a frontier supplied only with Mediterranean wine. Locally brewed beer suited existing tastes and practical supply. Wine still arrived. The two drinks occupied the same northern world without requiring one to erase the other. A message about beer is not a tavern scene ready-made. It may be a request, an account, or a problem of quantity. The archive gives the transaction more readily than the evening conversation around a cup. Outside, animals continue eating after people have finished. Cavalry horses need fodder, water, grooming, shelter, and attention to hooves and tack. Pack animals and cart animals require their own stores. Dogs move through fort and settlement. Livestock intended for food must be kept somewhere before slaughter. At a cavalry fort such as Chester's, animals shaped space and labor. Archaeologists have continued revising where horses were accommodated, because buildings once read as ordinary barracks can preserve drains, floor features, and arrangements suggesting that people and horses occupied connected spaces. The answer is architectural, not picturesque. A cavalry unit cannot be understood by counting riders while leaving out the animals beneath them. Fodder takes room, it catches damp, it can burn, it must arrive in seasons when roads and weather cooperate. A stable smell carries farther than lamplight. Someone knows which animal has refused feed, which strap needs mending, and which bucket leaks. Fuel belongs to the same system. Wood or charcoal feeds ovens, hearths, workshops, bathhouse furnaces, and lamps indirectly through the oil supply. Northern cold increases demand without creating endless forests beside every fort. Cutting, gathering, purchasing, drying, transporting, and storing fuel extend the garrison's needs into the surrounding landscape. The military economy affected communities on both sides of the frontier. Demand created opportunities and pressure. People sold goods and labor. Officials requisitioned or contracted. Taxes and obligations moved resources toward the army. The surviving records do not make every exchange voluntary or every participant prosperous. Inside a kitchen or bakery, a smaller measure is filled. Water darkens flour. Hands work dough. The oven gives back some of the heat the night has taken from the walls. No single loaf can explain the economy that produced it. Yet bread has gathered the road, field, granary, mill, fuel pile, ration list, and working body into something a person can hold. The lamp is set beside the bronze measure. Its rim casts a round shadow. Grain falls against metal with a soft, dry sound, then stops when the level reaches the edge. Here is the detail to carry with you. The frontier could be counted in miles, units, and towers. At supper, it became a smaller calculation. Enough grain in the measure, enough fodder in the stall, and enough fuel to keep tomorrow's oven warm. The lamp moves into a room where a letter has been opened. Its wooden leaf is thin enough to bend. Ink has faded toward invisibility. The surviving lines belong to a correspondence that once traveled by hand through roads, forts, houses, and offices along the northern frontier. Vinderlander's tablets contain military reports and accounts, but also invitations, requests, complaints, lists, greetings, and news. They bring people closer without making the archive complete. Officers and their households appear often because they wrote, received, stored, and discarded material in places where preservation later occurred. One famous tablet carries an invitation from Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina for a birthday celebration. Most of the letter was probably written by a scribe, while a closing greeting appears in another hand, often identified as Claudia's own. The lines preserve friendship between two women at the frontier and one of the earliest surviving examples of a woman's handwriting in Latin. The tablet does not give us the room, meal, weather, or private conversation of the gathering. Its importance does not depend on filling those spaces. Someone wanted another person to come. Distance required a message. Affection entered the record because a social occasion needed arranging. Another tablet became known for mentioning socks and underclothes sent with other goods. The items are often treated as comic proof that Romans felt cold. They are more useful when allowed to remain practical. Cloth protected skin, absorbed sweat, wore out, became wet, and needed replacement. A parcel from elsewhere could improve an ordinary week. Roman military images favor armor and weapons because those objects signify status and service. A frontier wardrobe also included cloaks, tunics, belts, footwear, wrappings, and repaired pieces whose exact combinations varied. Leather shoes survive at Vinderlander in remarkable numbers, from heavy adult footwear to small shoes associated with children. A shoe remembers pressure differently from a letter. Its sole wears where a foot repeatedly meets the ground. Stitch holes show construction. Patches show that replacement was not always immediate. Water enters through failure before archaeology enters through interpretation. The night outside is damp. A cloak near the doorway dries slowly. If the wool is too close to flame, it risks scorching. If it remains folded wet, it keeps the cold. Daily competence lies between those mistakes. Letters carried needs that military supply did not automatically meet. Friends and relatives sent clothing, money, food, and news. Officers requested goods from one another. Merchants pursued payment. A person seeking leave entered a chain of permission. A household maintained relationships across distances that modern maps make look smaller than travel made them feel. Some senders used scribes. A dictated letter still belonged to the sender, but the hand on the surface might belong to someone whose role was to turn speech into writing. At the end, a personal greeting could change the script. Two people then occupied one small piece of wood, one composing and another recording. Other people appear less directly. Enslaved attendants carried letters, managed household work, and entered accounts or addresses without controlling the archive around them. Soldiers of lower rank may appear in reports more often than in intimate correspondence. Local residents who did not write Latin on preserved tablets remain present in the economy and absent from many sentences. The tablets are therefore both intimate and unequal. They allow us to hear individual phrasing while reminding us that preservation follows power, literacy, material, disposal, and accident. At Vindolanda, some tablets were discarded on floors or in pits. Others entered a bonfire that did not entirely consume them. Wet ground closed around the fragments. Centuries later, infrared photography recovered carbon ink from wood that looked nearly blank. The letter beside our lamp will not be read aloud word for word. A generated voice should not pretend to replace the writer's exact one. It is enough to know that a greeting crossed the frontier and was kept long enough to be thrown away. Outside, a messenger continues along the road. Inside, someone folds a warmer piece of clothing around the body. The empire appears in official titles, but distance is answered by a parcel. Here is the detail to carry with you. A tablet about clothing survived because wood, ink, mud, and chance held together. The socks did not last. The request did. Beyond the fort wall, the bathhouse is closing. Many military bathhouses stood outside the main enclosure, where water, drainage, smoke, and fire could be managed without placing the entire process among crowded barracks. Their plans changed by site and period, but the work beneath comfort remained familiar. A visitor entered a changing space, then moved through rooms of different temperatures. Warmth prepared the body. Hotter rooms held heated air and water. A cold basin offered contrast. Oil, curved scrapers, towels, sandals, benches, cups, and personal belongings gathered around the sequence. At Chester's, the changing room was large enough to support exercise as well as undressing. The surviving building now stands open and cool near the river. Roof, doors, glazing, bodies, fabric, steam, and fire must be restored in thought before the rooms return to their former scale. The last bather leaving did not end the workers' tasks. Water remained to be managed. Floors needed cleaning. Ash accumulated. Fuel had to be stored dry. A furnace could be reduced carefully rather than abandoned. Heat already held in stone continued moving after the public rooms emptied. The hypocaust raised a floor on short brick supports, allowing hot air to pass beneath. Hollow elements could carry warmth into walls. This system is often described as Roman central heating, which is useful only if it does not hide the furnace, smoke, fuel, maintenance, and people required to keep it working. Comfort above depended on labor below. The service corridor was darker, hotter, and dirtier than the decorated room it served. Someone fed the fire without receiving the same experience as the person resting over it. Legal status, military rank, employment, and household power shaped who occupied each side of the floor. Bathing could support hygiene, exercise, sociability, patronage, and business. It was not equally available at every hour or on equal terms. Fees, custom, gender, status, building condition, and local arrangements changed access. A bathhouse beside a fort was a social place, not evidence that frontier life was uniformly comfortable. Nor was every evening crowded. The archive can let the rooms quiet without inventing a conversation. Water drips from the edge of a basin. A wooden object is set to dry. Condensation gathers where plaster has cooled. A lamp reflects in a surface disturbed by one remaining ripple. The building connects fort and settlement. Soldiers used it, but other residents and visitors may have entered according to local practice. Supplies arrived from outside the military enclosure. Wastewater left it. Smoke announced that heat was being made. Repair never ended. Roofs leaked, drains clogged, plaster cracked under moisture and temperature change, metal corroded, boilers and pipes required attention. A damaged bathhouse could be rebuilt or altered, and the sequence of rooms might change with it. At night, residual heat becomes a kind of clock. The hottest masonry cools slowly. Air beneath the floor loses movement. A room that was almost oppressive in use becomes merely warm, then mild, then cold before dawn if the furnace is not renewed. Our small lamp is set near the threshold. Its flame is unnecessary beside a strong furnace, then useful again as the fire is banked. The worker carrying it knows the service route better than the grandest visitor does. Here is the detail to carry with you. After the last person left the warm room, the floor continued giving back heat stored during the day. For a little while, the empty bathhouse remembered every fire beneath it. The lamp leaves the bathhouse and enters a smaller sacred space. Religion along Hadrian's wall did not arrive as one package. Official ceremonies, imperial loyalty, unit traditions, household practices, local deities, imported cults, vows, festivals, and private habits overlapped. The people of the frontier came from different regions and did not abandon every old attachment when they entered Roman service or trade. Altars survive because stone survives well and because a public dedication was meant to remain visible. Their inscriptions can name a deity, a dedicator, a military rank, a unit, a fulfilled vow, or a date. They record an action more securely than a complete belief. At Housesteads, a sandstone altar dedicated to Mithras was set in a mithrium, a building associated with the cult. A later inscription names a centurion, Publius Proculinus, making a dedication for himself and his son Proculus in the year 252. The altar supports a narrow and valuable statement. Mithraic worship existed at housesteads, and one centurion publicly connected himself and his son to a vow. It does not prove that every soldier followed Mithras, that women and children had no religious lives, or that the whole frontier shared one secret faith. Elsewhere, dedications joined Roman gods with local names. Soldiers carried deities from their regions of origin. Communities adopted, translated, or combined practices. A person could participate in an official ceremony and still keep household observances that left little material trace. The wall's population included auxiliaries with unit identities connected to places such as Spain, the Low Countries, or Syria, though recruitment changed over generations. Inscriptions preserve some origins vividly and leave others uncertain. A unit name is not a reliable birthplace for every later soldier who served beneath it. Local people also shaped frontier religion. Roman authority did not create sacred landscapes from nothing. Springs, rivers, hills, groves, and older places of worship already carried meaning. New altars could occupy a world whose significance had not begun in Latin. At Karaburg, near the wall, a temple to Mithras stood close to a spring and other sacred activity. The neat separation of religions on a modern museum label does not necessarily describe how a person experienced neighboring places. Night changes a shrine, carved letters become harder to read, relief figures lose their edges. Flame makes a shallow groove appear deeper, then lets it disappear again. Smoke darkens a ceiling slowly enough that no single offering creates the mark. We should not supply a prayer the inscription does not preserve. A vow may be public while the reason remains private. Illness, promotion, family, travel, danger, gratitude, duty, and habit are all possible, but possibility is not permission to choose one. The frontier's gods also belonged to calendars and communities. Festivals interrupted ordinary schedules. Offerings required food, vessels, fuel, and cleaning. A shrine had a material life even when belief remains beyond excavation. Someone trims the lamp. A little soot collects near the nozzle. Oil lowers in the reservoir. The act can be practical and sacred at once without the archive deciding the balance. Outside, the wall continues through darkness. It has often been used in later centuries as a symbol of absolute division. The dedications beside it tell a more complicated story. People from distant places served, traded, raised families, kept vows, learned local conditions, and left names in stone while many neighbors remained unnamed. Here is the detail to carry with you. The altar preserves the person who paid for the inscription and the god publicly addressed. It does not preserve the quiet thought between them. The deepest part of the vow stayed unwritten. Return now to the walls. The lamp is covered as the door opens. Wind presses against cloak and hinge. Rain travels almost sideways across exposed ground, then eases, then returns in finer drops that find seams in leather and wool. Northern Britain did not offer one permanent climate, and we should not invent a temperature for this night. The archaeological frontier experienced winters, wet seasons, dry intervals, snow, fog, frost, and long summer light across many decades. Weather varied from the Tyne to the Solway and from valley to crag. What matters inside the watchpost is more immediate. Wet footwear softens and rubs. A cloak becomes heavier. Fingers lose ease. Flame consumes oil faster when it struggles in moving air. Stone takes heat from a person leaning against it. Vinderlander's leather survives because waterlogged deposits protected what would normally decay. Thousands of shoes and fragments reveal construction, wear, repair, sizes, and varied users. They do not prove that every person had adequate footwear. A repaired sole can demonstrate skill and scarcity at the same time. At a turret, height improves the view but does not remove darkness. The watcher can attend to a road, a gateway, a slope, and the direction of the next post. Cloud erases the moon, mist shortens distance. A known landmark disappears until the weather changes. No attack is required. Most hours of military readiness do not become battles. The work is to remain capable of recognizing a change, movement where none is expected, a delayed messenger, an animal loose near the road, a gate signal from within the system, smoke where a roof should be dark. We have limited evidence for exactly how turrets communicated at night across every phase of the wall. It is tempting to place signal fires in a perfect chain, but attempting reconstruction is not the same as a documented routine. The script can leave the distant tower dark. Below, a crossing concentrates sound. Water runs in a ditch. A loose fitting taps against wood. Hooves on stone differ from boots, though distance and rain make certainty slower. Watchfulness is a practice of waiting before deciding what a sound means. The people beyond the wall were not a faceless threat waiting in darkness. Communities north and south of the frontier traded, traveled, negotiated, resisted, served, and adapted. Roman writers often compressed diverse peoples into military categories useful to Roman concerns. Archaeology restores a landscape of farms, routes, objects, and local choices that no single hostile label can contain. The wall could enforce Roman power through gates, patrols, taxation, surveillance, and the presence of armed units. It could also be crossed through official and ordinary movement. Its strength did not make it absolute. Inside the turret, a person shifts weight to keep warm. We do not assign a name. The roster that once contained it may be gone. Rank, origin, age, and legal history remain unknown. The body is still allowed practical needs: dry cloth, rest, food, a functioning shoe, and relief when the duty ends. Elsewhere, someone sleeps because this person does not. In a barrack, breath and low fire warm a room imperfectly. In a settlement, a child turns beneath bedding. In the hospital, a lamp may remain lit for another reason. In the stable, an animal stamps against the cold. The frontier at night is held together by these uneven exchanges of wakefulness. A gate detail waits for a messenger. A furnace worker keeps heat moving. A clerk has counted those absent. A household has saved a little oil. Rain passes. The air clears enough for the line of the wall to return, first as a darker shape, and then as wet stone catching a trace of light. Here is the detail to carry with you. The next tower does not need to be visible every minute to remain part of the system. Knowledge holds its place through the weather. Beyond the small circle of the lamp, the road continues where it was before the dark. The eastern sky changes slowly enough that the lamp remains useful after darkness has begun to loosen. Stone separates into individual blocks. Grass returns around the road. Water on a threshold reflects a color that was not present an hour before. The frontier has reached morning without the dramatic event later storytelling expects from a night watch. That quiet is not an absence of history. A gate must be opened or inspected. A relief arrives. Animals are watered. Fires are encouraged back into work. Grain is measured. A report is carried toward an office. Someone who remained awake can finally leave the post. The wall's ordinary life lasted across generations, but not without interruption. Units moved, buildings changed. The frontier shifted north to the Antonine Wall in the 2nd century and later returned to Hadrian's line. Forts were rebuilt. Civilian settlements expanded in some periods. Gateways narrowed or lost their original purpose. By the early 5th century, Roman imperial government in Britain had ended. That phrase does not mean every person vanished from the frontier on one date. At places such as Birdoswald, archaeology has supported arguments for continued occupation and changing forms of local authority after formal Roman systems weakened. Stone entered later lives. Walls became sources of building material. Farms, roads, churches, houses, field boundaries, and local traditions developed around the remains. The name Hadrian stayed attached to a structure whose post-Roman history became much longer than its original military use. Excavation brought another change. Antiquarians collected inscriptions and sculpture. Archaeologists opened buildings, recorded layers, revised plans, and sometimes interpreted limited evidence too confidently. Conservation protected exposed masonry while also adding modern material to ancient walls. The Vindelander tablets survived through conditions no archive could have designed. Thin wooden leaves entered wet ground with little oxygen. Leather shoes, textiles, and other organic things lasted beside them. Excavation removed those objects from the environment that had protected them, creating immediate obligations for conservation. Infrared photography made faint ink legible. Specialists joined fragments, compared hands, revised readings, and published uncertainty. A translation is not the tablet speaking without mediation. It is careful modern work performed across damaged Latin, missing word, abbreviations, handwriting, context, and debate. The wall above ground has its own conservation demands. Rain enters joints, frost moves water through stone, roots open cracks, foot traffic wears paths, drainage changes. Protecting one section may require leaving another undisturbed. The archive therefore remains active. A strength report can be reread. A shoe can be studied for construction and wear. Soil beneath a building can revise an account of horses. An altar can be placed back into the sequence of a shrine rather than displayed as isolated decoration. A representative night now separates into its sources. The milecastle gate belongs to one surviving plan. The strength report belongs to an earlier Vindelander fort. The bronze grain measure was found at Carvoren. The bathhouse at Chester's cooled on nights we cannot count. The Mithraic altar at Housesteads was dedicated more than a century after the wall began. They were never one's recorded evening. Bringing them together has not recovered a lost diary. It has shown how a frontier night depended on repeated work. Passage controlled, names counted, grain protected, animals fed, letters carried, heat maintained, vows kept, clothing dried, and darkness watched without requiring it to produce an enemy. The people who performed that work came from different places and occupied unequal positions. Officers appear often in writing. Enslaved people, laborers, local residents, women, children, and lower-ranking soldiers enter less evenly. Silence in the record is not proof of absence from the wall. Walk once more to the milecastle where we began. The gate is visible now. Beyond it, the road passes through the wall rather than ending there. Morning movement will wear the same threshold a little further. The small lamp has nearly emptied. A person trims the wick, sees that dawn has made the flame unnecessary, and closes the cover. We cannot name that person. We cannot say whether the lamp belonged to a soldier, a servant, a traveler, or a room assembled only by our narrative. Archaeology preserves lamps of this kind. It preserves soot, metal, clay, ware, and places where light was needed. The last hand remains outside the file. That is the proper limit for tonight. The wall gives us structures large enough to cross a country and objects small enough to fit in a palm. Between them lived people whose routines made imperial power function and whose private nights were never fully recorded by it. The road is open again. The stone is wet. Somewhere beyond the next rise, another gate begins its morning work. That is where I will close the file for tonight. The archive will be here tomorrow. It always is. Sleep well.